So in a week and a half, we are going to be in this room with our lights dim and candles in hand as we announce that the waiting is over and Christmas is here. But today, on the third Sunday of Advent, we continue to sit in that space of waiting and leaning into the word expectation. Now, if you've been following the Advent reader that Kendra has put on our website, then you've certainly been able to probably nod your head now and again as the mix of expectancy and doubt emerge as though they are echoes of our own hearts. Why don't we believe? Why don't we expect? Why do we expect with such tenuous faith? Why, for all of our longing and looking and praying and seeking for a miracle, do we find it easier to insist that God is uninterested in our story? And I wonder if sometimes it's easier to lean into the narrative that there is not much possible, not much able, not much coming. I wonder if it's easier to see ourselves as forgotten, to get comfortable in being ones who are overlooked, the ones who view themselves as not seen, the ones just outside of God's reach. For in that space, we are in control. When you read Luke chapter 1's account of Zechariah, you meet a man who has done everything right. He's described as blameless. One who keeps the commandments of God, one who is known for their righteousness, yet they've been able to have children. And it's a passage that's laced with sadness that so many can relate to. That ongoing sorrow that is found in the realization that what you expected to be the next step is simply not possible. Yet despite their great loss and despite their prayers going unanswered, despite the assumptions that surround them and the questions asked of them, they remain faithful. While for many this type of faithfulness may be too much to ask, an ongoing faithfulness, persistence, righteousness in the midst of acknowledging what has been desired and longed for will never happen. Yet even here, as ones titled blameless, despite their faithfulness, they live as ones who are forgotten, somehow out of God's reach, the ones who, despite all they have done, remain unseen. They still believe, but they don't believe for themselves. Zechariah is one of the priests, and he faithfully serves the people. He faithfully helps individuals find absolution for their sin. He faithfully seeks to lead the people in their acts of worship. He faithfully helps those who encounter him to see God and to be reminded that God sees them. This is a quiet faithfulness, a persistent righteousness, an ongoing life of service. Zechariah is one who understands that God sees, but he is also one who insists that God does not see him. And so when he arrives to offer the incense in the sanctuary of the temple, with the crowds waiting just outside, he finds himself in a familiar space, in the midst of a familiar ritual. This is where he has been over and over and over again, faithfully serving, faithfully offering, faithfully believing for others in the midst of his own disappointment. It's there that he sees an angel. And his immediate response is overwhelm and fear as the angel speaks the unexpected words that he had longed to hear. Your wife will give birth to a son, and you will name him John. Now, Zechariah can hardly believe it, even though the angel stands before him, even though he's having this supernatural encounter, even though it appears God has met him at his point of need and prayer, he simply can't believe it. Because sometimes the most obvious pronouncements are the ones we so easily disbelieve. For so long, the narrative has been that God is for others, that his encounter with God is to bolster the faith of those around him. For so long, it has been obvious to him that God has forgotten him, that God does not see him, that God does not see his wife Elizabeth. And it's been so long that this is now where he finds his solace and his comfort. A God who speaks to and for others, a God who sees those around him, a God he administers for others, yet does not see for himself, a God who is for others, a God who is silent for him. This is a narrative that we see over and over again in scriptures. From the pictures we are painted of Eve, who wonders if God is for her, Abraham, who wonders if God will do what God says. Sarai, who laughs in the face of God's promise. Jacob, who attempts to outwit those around him so that he can win. The Israelites sitting in slavery, waiting for the Exodus. The prophets speaking with no one listening, leaving them with a constant wonder if God is more than talk. The Israelites found in exile, taken from their homeland and their worship and their familiar spaces, left to wonder, where is God? If God has forgotten them, learning to believe that God cannot see them. And so we shouldn't be surprised when we meet Zechariah in this very same space and state of mind, standing in the presence of an angel, standing within the sanctuary of the temple, hearing the very words he longed to hear, the very words he had stopped believing. You are not forgotten. You are seen. Even you, and especially you, are within God's reach. In fact, the very God you imagined is for others has always been for you. Yet despite the words and despite the presence of an angel, despite all of the spectacular and supernatural, Zechariah wonders if the angel has got it right. He wonders if after all these years of letting go of his expectation that God could remember him, he wonders if even this is too much hope, if he can believe the words spoken in the sanctuary. And so he asks, how can I know this will happen? The question that those who have not yet found themselves, this is a question that those who have not yet found themselves on the other side know well. It's a question that those who have spent their life believing without seeing understand. It's the question that those whose faith has been wrapped up in the bolstering of the faith of others while their own dwindles ask all too often. How can I know this will happen? The angel's response is one that I read as incredulous, even though it might not have been, when the angel says, I am Gabriel, I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you good news. In other words, God is speaking. Are you listening? That's the question for all of us. God is speaking. Are you listening? The story is told that Zechariah goes mute and is unable to speak until the day his son is born. And I used to imagine that to be an act of punishment for not giving a speedy enough response, a warm enough response, a hearty enough response to the angel. But what if it was an invitation to pay attention? What if it was an invitation to reconnect? What if it was an invitation for Zechariah to find his way to the place that I hope for all of us? To see that he is not overlooked, he is not forgotten, he is not out of God's reach, he is seen. I wonder if the silence was a part of Zechariah seeing that he didn't have to prove anything. He was not required to do something to comfort anyone, to absolve a people, to speak the words he had always spoken for the good of his community, for the good of those who were entrusted to him. No, in this moment, all he had to do was pay attention. For it is there in his own silence that he would hear God. And we know that this was a life-changing encounter, because after the birth of John, his son, this unexpected miracle, he bursts into song and he says these words, because of the tender mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us to shine upon those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. And we know that when he ushered the words, the way of peace, it is a declaration that God had encountered, that the God he had encountered, the God he had re-encountered, is the God who makes all things new. It's a God who makes all things whole, to make all things as they are intended from the beginning. And this time, Zechariah could announce with confidence that this message of peace, this message of shalom, was not simply for others, for those in his council, for those around him, but this message, this hope, this peace, this God was also for him. Not forgotten, not overlooked, not out of reach, but seen by God. That is good news. And I wish that all of our stories were so dramatic in the ways that we come to understand that despite what we see around us and what we have experienced, that God is for us. I wish for that, but I pray for this. That in these last days of Advent, as we lean into expectation, as we wait, as we hope, As we long for all things to be made new, my prayer is that you will have time to lean into the same invitation that was offered to Zechariah, to simply pay attention. Listening and looking for all of the ways that God speaks over each of us this truth. We are seen. God knows where we are. We are not forgotten. I pray that you will end this Advent season with expectation that is fueled by the ways God speaks when you pause long enough to listen. That you will be inspired by the ways God is made evident when you make space to look around. That your faith, your hope, will be renewed as you find yourself awakened to the Spirit's whisper. I pray that as we prepare to gather next week on the 24th, whether here or elsewhere, that we come having encountered and re-encountered the God who makes all things new. The God who is making all things whole. The God whose invitation to make all things as they were intended is not just for you to offer to others, but is what God offers to you. And so as we prepare to sit in the wonder and the miracle of Christmas, as we sing, as we light candles, as we gather with family and with friends, as we pause to embrace the miracle of Christmas, my prayer is that you will be deeply enfolded by this truth. You are not forgotten. You are and you always have been seen. Even you, and especially you, are within God's reach. They have never left you. In fact, the very God you imagine is for others has always been for you. Let the church say, amen.